good afternoon, and wherever you are on the face of the earth. Welcome to another episode for Securing the Digital Supply Chain. My name is Anirban. I'm the co founder and CEO of Riscosity. And with me today, I have two very well known personalities from the security industry. The first one being Taslimm Qureshi, and the second one being Mike Machado. I've known Taslimm for some time. Taslimm has had different kinds of roles all over the technology industry in various positions, leadership positions. And what we have seen is he's currently now at Amazon, and I'll let him fill in on his experience and the path that he has had. And Mike and I have known each other for, oh gosh, many, many, many years now. And Mike has given me invaluable advice. He's been a shoulder to kind of lean on for me for a long time. So thank you to you both for being here. We really appreciate your time and patience in helping us. With that being said, I think it would be very helpful for our viewers to get an understanding of where you are coming from, your experiences. Taslim, if you could go first and maybe let us know about your background, your areas of interest, and where you are. And then maybe we can have Mike give the same intro for himself, and then we'll jump into our discussion.
Sounds great. Thank you, Anirban, for having us here. I think my security experience goes back to my teenage years when we were on an ISP called BSNL dial-up back home in India. And getting free internet was a big, big, big thing. So we used to hack into those ISPs. It's getting recorded, I know, but I think BSNL is no more. So I think I'm okay. But though that's how I started within security, and that journey has continued from my teenage years till date. I've had various roles. I've consulted with various government entities across the world, and continue to work with governments at this point in time as well, in a very consultative capacity. And so I've had various security roles, and in my current role also, I'm kind of looking at GRC and other stuff, but a little away from security at this point in time. But that's been the journey. I wanted to keep it brief, but that's been the journey.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Mike, over to you, sir.
Hi, I'm Mike. I've been doing, I'd say, dedicated security work for about 20 years with kind of security adjacent work for a number of years prior to that. I've done the gamut from, individual contributor to like team leader, manager, CISO work, strategy, tactical execution, and several different security domains I've had hands-on responsibilities and or managerial responsibilities for. Thanks, Anirban.
Perfect. And as the viewers have already understood, you guys have had tons of experience. So I think we'll have a great show today. The first question, I think, that kind of covers some of the concerns that people oftentimes have when they talk to us. When you, as security leaders, see or hear that there is a product under your purview, which is talking to third-party vendors, typically using APIs, or is using third-party code, SDKs, open source libraries, anything of that sort, what kind of threat model goes through your mind? What are the areas of concern that you think about from a business risk perspective? Taslim, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think risk becomes so much paramount when we're trying to evaluate or even work with third parties, right? I think the data comes to my mind right at the top in terms of what are we sharing, what is going through the pipes, and how are they utilizing my information, how are they securing my information, are they able to secure my information or not, or how are they utilizing that information. So I think those are the things that immediately kind of come top of my mind in terms of how things are being managed on my behalf, because I think third parties have their own way of doing things. I think you always work with legal, vendor management, and everybody else to bring them on board. But there is that gap in terms of the legal contracts would put stipulations in place as to what should be there.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, what actually is there is not monitored on an ongoing basis, right? And that becomes a big gap in terms of, okay, today I got a certification, a compliance certification from a vendor to say that, yes, I am compliant, but that's a check in the box, right? I think that check in the box will come up again next year when you ask for it again, right? And over that period of time, the risk that we are exposing an organization to is something that goes unnoticed. So I think those are some of the factors that kind of immediately come to my mind. Mike, I'll pass it on to you for your thoughts.
Thank you. I guess the first thought that comes to mind is really a question, right, or a desire to understand what's going on. Is it? I mean, third parties exist in many different use cases, right? Is it just code, but all the data staying in my span of control, right? Is it data being shared with a third party? If it is, what data is being shared with a third party? Do I have obligations? Um, in contracts, in regulations, et cetera, to, have certain safeguards, with respect to this data. How do I know that what's being discussed verbally is the actual scope and not, we're sharing more data or, whatever the case may be in certain situations. Um, Taz mentioned that you get audit reports, certifications, et cetera, but really what you get is a blind spot, right? With they can, I mean, it's great to have this notion of someone's audited them, and there's a certain amount of diligence that goes into that, right? Because we've probably all been in organizations that have also been audited, but you also know that they're not perfect, that the technology landscape changes in the period of time between audits, right? That some audits or certification programs, et cetera, are more shallow, some dive deeper, and they're just not a
Correct. Correct.
replacement
Correct.
for any sort of meaningful visibility, right? The other things I'd wonder are what how is this data classified? Is it changing without anyone discussing it? Meaning we all you all of a sudden start sending something more, right? That wasn't discussed in the initial use case, or et cetera, et cetera. So all these things come to mind. You absolutely, I agree with Taz, need to manage the risk, right? Sometimes you do that with contracts, audits come into play, certifications, et cetera. But there's no such thing as doing this without incurring risk, because much remains a blind spot.
But this actually is a very nice segue into the whole question of when we look at it from an angle of compliance, right? Whether it is GDPR compliance or CCPA, CPRA, these things have been developed in some sense to keep privacy these things in check and whatnot. It's a noble intention, but has it complicated life in dealing with third party vendors?
Yes and no, right? So on the one hand, I think we'd be hard pressed to find a regulation that's amazing at what it's setting out to do. To your point, noble intentions, right? But then they get implemented. They get like lobbied, negotiated, watered
Yep.
down,
Yep.
and then they even if they were good to start, they get stale because technology and the way the world works in terms of technical applications changes rapidly, right? And legislation doesn't typically change rapidly, and so with that being the case, there's always an element of just bureaucratic steps that need to be followed for any regulation. It's the nature of regulations, right? It's inescapable, it's unavoidable. It doesn't mean that any meaningful security is being achieved, right? Just because you go through steps, you get certain
Correct. Correct.
documents, you check certain boxes, et cetera. Um, I think there are good things that can and do come out of regulations as well, though. Like, for example, products that make it easier to do something that was previously more difficult, or vendors that understand you have uh, obligations from your own company that they have to help you meet, as opposed to if there's a complete absence of, say, regulations or whatnot. uh, there's less incentive for a company to step up and sort of meet you halfway, right? If you're just asking because you have your own business needs, right? It's a lot easier to point to a law and say, hey, the law says I've got to do this and this and that. Other things are sort of somewhere in the middle, in my experience, meaning how well do you apply the intent, and the requirements of the regulation in practice, right? Do you
Yes, yes,
just sort of go through the motions? Uh, do you follow the spirit of what the regulations, trying to achieve? Um, and I think overall, there's probably more good than bad, from these regulations, right? I mean, you can look at the bureaucracy as being generally a negative outcome of regulations, but you can also look at the fact that you know that there are more practices around securing data as a net positive, right? I mean, the
yes,
regulations aren't going to make data protection perfect. They're not going to make security perfect. They're not going to make privacy perfect. Um, but they definitely have succeeded at making uh, a stronger, set of motions, across, across businesses, across jurisdictions, et cetera, uh, which have, in my opinion, generally made things better than if there was no incentive to do those
yep.
motions in the first place. That's my 2 cents.
No,
No,
go ahead, Taslim, please.
yeah, I was saying, Mike, that's an amazing perspective, right? I think, and privacy is such a contentious or domain as such, right? I think you talk to people in the US and you talk to people in Europe, it's a very different set of
Yeah.
opinions that come across, right? I think, or if you go back to the olden days of kings and queens, you could get killed for invading somebody's privacy, right? I think so. Going from that
Are
side.
you proposing that as an evolution of our regulatory landscape?
I'll support it.
I think the intent of that example was that privacy has always been a top-down kind of an approach versus a bottom-up kind of an approach, right? I think
Yes,
it's the regulators, it's the higher bodies that put things in place, and then people understand that we need to do something about it. I think it's also a mindset. But at the end of the day, it's basically more like people at the bottom of the pyramid are not that concerned essentially about privacy as people are at the top of the pyramid, right? I think in a general way. So I think my idea of taking that example was that privacy or compliance or regulations have to typically be driven top down. And there is always, I think, the good and the bad part of it. I think Mike so clearly mentioned the bureaucracy or the things that get into the way of getting things done, right? I think how fast you
yes,
move in an organization sometimes is slowed down by regulations, right? And the regulations is always two steps behind technology, right? So you keep complying, but technology moves at such a fast pace that regulations don't necessarily keep up with the technological changes that happen around. So I think that ways, I think privacy kind of GDPR and all these things are helping organizations, I think, also streamline how much they consume, right? As an organization data, because if they have to manage and maintain all that data over a period of time, that becomes very expensive as well. So I think it is kind of helping organizations rationalize themselves in terms of what they should keep, what they should not keep, and making people more aware of what their rights and obligations are in terms of whether they want certain data to be saved, certain things to be remembered, and certain things not to be remembered. So I think it's also about legacy at that point in time in terms of what are you going to leave behind kind of a thing. So I think it all kind of comes down together in terms of bringing the whole privacy discussion in a nutshell. I think it definitely, like Mike mentioned, a lot of positive comes out of it, and there are definitely some negatives for organizations, especially I think for SMBs or things like that, where they're not geared enough to consume, manage, maintain, and be in compliance with a lot of these regulations as well, where the cost becomes a big factor, right? And that's where the automation and what tools and newer organizations can help with, I think, come into play.
Very
I'll
important.
say that I think privacy's also had less success in the regulatory landscape than security if the goal is effectiveness, right? I'm not saying there's been less legislation. I think there's probably been more privacy legislation than any sort of cybersecurity legislation
Right,
or
right.
regulations and whatnot. But if the goal of, let's say, security uh, regulations are to have more resilient technology landscape, and that security regulation says you must patch your infrastructure, then patching your infrastructure is already like a known good, right? And and having an incentive to patch your infrastructure and following through on that incentive means you know your infrastructure is actually better protected, right? So you've achieved sort of the goal of security. You've lowered the risk to whether it's your business, your information, etc. Whereas if a privacy regulation comes along, and there are many already existing, of course, and yet we find ourselves to not actually have any more privacy, right? I don't think individuals really have any more privacy. Maybe slightly, right? More so, and or if you look at sort of old versions of privacy, before the technology component came into play, part of privacy was viewed as the right to be left alone, right? And clearly, that's not something that's being achieved by modern privacy legislation, not in any meaningful way. Though I do observe, at least in my opinion, that we're inching closer toward that, right? Meaning that current versions of privacy legislation are maybe putting the track in place so that eventually we can get to a point where you can simply say, hey, leave me alone, don't send me advertisements, or the default for me is you're not following and watching, right? And so data subjects can say that. It's not nearly been that successful yet. And so I think privacy struggles a bit, despite having more legislation than security to achieve the real goals of the effort.
How are CISOs and CIO, whoever is in charge of the business risk, what is an effective way then to verbalize this risk to the C level from a privacy perspective, from a security perspective? What are some strategies that you use to verbalize it effectively to the C level and the board?
I think taking that discussion and up leveling it to the boards has always been an interesting concept, right? I think a lot of CISOs that are technologically so strong, they know their, I probably won't use that word, they know their things, right? And they understand the domain that they are in. I think sometimes what becomes difficult is how do I take it to a 50,000 feet view level and give a very simple, clean, I, if I have 30 minutes in my board meeting, right, which typically is what you get, I have to convey the risks, I have to convey what I need, and I have to convey what I expect from them, right? And at that point in time, it becomes a discussion around how am I going to take the risks to a level where it is very easily understood by them? How do I rationalize it for them? How do I make them see what's happening around the world and how that could impact us, right? And then the ask always is how do I get my budget, so whatever else we need from the board in terms of uh, people resources or budgets, right? And how am I able to make it easier for people to understand that aspect? So I think the simplification of security at the board level and attaching some sort of daily activity that they are doing that could directly link to the security. So, how do I make it more personal for them to understand that, hey, the security that the organization facing is also very similar to the security issues that you might be facing on a day-to-day basis at your end? So they are able to identify with what the CISO is trying to tell them, right? Otherwise, a lot of times I've been in board meetings where you talk technically and you lose the audience, right? They still, and they're very smart people, so they understand what you're trying to bring to the table, but sometimes you lose the audience in terms of what you're trying to convey there. So I think that I've seen has been successful, bringing a lot of metrics, bringing a lot of data points to elaborate also helps because a lot of people on the board want to know what was your basis of coming to that conclusion. So if you have that handy with you, is also very very helpful. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you touched on this, and I'll kind of double click on it, right? But as you take the message from a technical audience to a business audience, your technical security skills play less and less of a role, right? And your business skills and your communication skills play a larger and larger role. So part of the way you do this is by developing those skills, right? That's an important part that any security leader or any privacy leaders, um, call it their own development, their own, path and trajectory needs to include, because it doesn't make sense. It's not appropriate for the audience to be talking at, let's say the implementation level in these meetings. So uh, if you follow this logic, then you need to be framing the discussion in business terms, right? What's the risk to our business? What's the risk to our customers? Where is that risk coming from? What are we doing to either, manage that risk, meaning reduce that risk or accept that risk? Which one, like so that everyone's got their eyes open that some risk is being accepted, because in all parts of a business, some risk is always accepted, right? It's never the goal that you're going to eliminate it completely. Are
Correct.
we doing things to transfer the risk? Insurance and whatnot, things like that. And then are we making the progress that we've agreed we want to be making over time? Right? Those are all important ways to engage at that level and to communicate what progress you're making with regard to the overall initiatives.
Very nice. Thank you. One thing that I would ask, that since you both have been in the security industry for quite some time and you've seen various types of products that have been deployed, developed, and so on and so forth, um, it seems from talking to people, from engineering leaders, for security leaders, that the rate at which APIs for various services are being integrated into solutions, primarily so that products can reach revenue generating status faster. This rate seems to be accelerating. What are some of the thoughts from your side, from a security perspective, when you hear that, oh, we are using X service, Y service? What would you like to double click on when you hear any of these things, that we use X for authentication, Y for something else? How do you think about going and saying that, I should look at that?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that come to mind, right? Similar to your question about third parties, that opened our discussion. One question I have is always, what does that really mean, right? How are we using these APIs? What are we using them for? Who are the parties behind them?
Yes.
What are we sending them? How do we know it's secure? How do we even know we're sending it securely? All of these things come to mind. Um, Other things are, how do we get in front of this rather than behind this so you're not chasing it, right? How can you see that this is happening? Or better yet, have a discussion that someone wants to do this before it's even being done. And,
Right, right,
and
right,
then
right.
if no one's told you ahead of time, how do you at least find out that it's happening, once it starts? Um,
Yes.
I would say, how are we keeping those interactions secure, right? How are we protecting our API keys, or if they're your APIs, how are you knowing that the right parties on the other end are using are the right parties, right? The intended parties to be
Correct.
using your APIs. Um, if you're building the APIs, it's how are we testing our APIs, right? You can't like test an API in the same way you test a web app that has a user interface, for example. You need different manners of testing. Um, if it's um, an API you're consuming, then is it something you want to test, right? Sometimes
Yes.
you want to test the infrastructure, the application, the security, et cetera, of something you're using. It's not just always testing something you're building. So all of these things, come to mind for me. I suppose, you know, talking about things that are security adjacent, what's the resilience of the API? How do you know if it's going down? Is the use of
Mhm.
that API going to affect your own service availability? In which case maybe you need you know SLAs in the agreement, and not just security terms in the agreement with this party, et cetera.
Perfect.
These are all kind of things I think about.
Now, I think Mike, you touched upon. I think most of the things. I think the blind spot typically is where are you sourcing it from, and how are you using it internally in the organization, right? And who are you letting know that this is something that I'm consuming? Because I mean, you have a credit card, you can stand up anything that you want in these days and times, right? I think you spin up whatever servers you want, you spin up whatever services you want, and get that all rolling. So I think from a hygiene perspective, having that process and program in place, and how do you utilize it, how are you educating people around it as well, which is your community of developers that are going to use this and all of that. So I think that also kind of plays a part in making sure that we're securing this correctly. And if there is a way to automate all this process in the life cycle, I think that would make life so much easier, right? I think which is where I think there is a gap at this point in time, in terms of there is no uh, not something that completely automates this whole thing, and that's a space I think which is very interesting.
Correct. From a perspective of, and since you've both held positions at very large companies, mid-sized companies, you've advised SMBs, various types of companies. For CISOs of organizations that are in the large SMB, mid-size SMB space, or even small enterprise, limited team size essentially, what would your advice be in terms of handling this third-party risk type of monster? What are some of the two or three things that you think are most effective that are actually achievable for people with limited teams?
That's very, yeah. I think
What a
Mike,
difficult question.
yeah, I think it's a loaded question. At the same time, I think the answer to some of it is basic hygiene, right? When it comes to security, right? I mean, if you look at whatever CIS or anything else that you want to focus on, right? I think are you do you have your authentication in place correctly? Simple things like that, right? Multi-factor, all these different aspects of hygiene, whether it is awareness of enabling teams to become the extended arms of security, right? I think sometimes we think of the weakest link in the organization. How do I convert the weakest link to become the strongest factor for my organization, right? I think because we even in large organizations, you struggle for right talent and hiring the right people, right? I think so. That is a huge challenge for smaller organizations that cannot throw the money around to hire the right people, right? So, how do you enable a basic hygiene? How do you standardize things across the organization? I think automation in today's age and time kind of plays a huge role in that. And how are you able
Right.
to take that automation to the next level, enabling your employees to become uh, your eyes and ears on the ground, right? In terms of saying, you are not my weakest link, but you are my biggest strength, because I depend on you to kind of provide me that eyes and ears on the ground so that I can be more effective as a CISO, right? So those are some things that kind of immediately come to my mind, and I think Mike might have a lot of more war stories to share there.
I don't know about war stories. I guess I've got, opinions. And to so framing up your question again, Honorbon, right? You're essentially running a team. You don't have a lot of people, but you have to manage third party risk, right? So clearly, your what you really need is tools that are gonna do big jobs for the fewer number of people that you have, right? So
Yes.
those tools need to give you insight into, um, you know, the risk of various organizations that you're working with. That's challenging to get, candidly. I mean, it's easy to say like have a tool do a thing. It's hard to find a tool that does it really well. Um, you need tools that will help you manage a cadence of interactions with these parties in an ideal state, right? Because you're not going to have a large team of like people, let's say, sending out questionnaires or things like that, right?
Correct. Correct.
um,
Correct.
so that doesn't mean you don't want to have questions and answers back with these other parties. It just means you don't have a bunch of people to generate that heartbeat. So a tool that does that for you or that assists with that would be great. I think part of a strategy for this specific scenario you described is communicating to the company's leadership team and the board what you're not able to cover in terms of third party risk, right?
Yes.
It's going to be clear that in the scenario you described, you can't do it all. There's going to be trade-offs that you have to make, and one of those trade-offs is going to be, hey, we need to take our eyes off some of this third party risk because we simply, there aren't enough eyes to go around, right?
Correct.
And so being forthright and transparent about that is important. You made a comment earlier, which I forgot to comment on at the time, but I'll bring it up now. You said for CISOs and other data protection officers and whatnot, people who own the risk in the organization, the CISO and the data protection officers don't own the risk in the organization, right? The organization owns the risk,
Yes.
usually spread out among the leadership team,
Yes.
the board. Most companies don't have like a chief risk officer, a
Yeah.
specific role who's like the point of managing all things risk related.
Yes.
So in order to be successful at managing risk, one of the important activities of CISOs and data protection officers is to communicate the risk to the parts of the organization that need to be informed of it and making those trade-off decisions, right? Because again, it's always trade-offs, puts and
Yes.
takes. It's
Correct.
never, well, hey, get us down to zero risk, and it's usually not, hey, we'll accept everything, right? But in the middle there is, what risk are we going to mitigate? What risk are we going to try and trade away? Insurance or things like that. What risk are we going to accept?
Very interesting. I mean, when you started talking about it, my brain immediately went to the Joe Sullivan case, and I said, we don't have time for that right now. But I do agree that the organization owns the risk. It's not like a 1 point person just because you have a CISO. Well, good luck, Mike. Well, no, it's everybody's problem, right? Taslim?
And I think it's such an interesting point, Mike, because I think the understanding in the board or anywhere else in the organization is that if something goes wrong from a security perspective, I'm going to hold the CISO responsible for it, right? And a lot of time, the risk doesn't boil down to an organizational risk, but becomes an individual's risk that you should have managed it and you didn't, and then heads are on the chopping block at that point in time, right? I think, but I think I completely agree with you. The fact that I think the risk is not an individual's risk, right? I think the individual knew about that risk. The individual would have informed you of that risk as well. And sometimes that is not possible in certain scenarios. But at the end of the day, the organization needs to own the risk and collectively come together to either in the remediation, acceptance, avoidance, whatever it might be, to take care of it. I think it's a team effort versus an individual effort. So I completely agree with you on that.
For sure. I think we're in a time today where there's less, finger pointing and chopping blocks than there used to be, which is good. I think it's not fully behind, behind the security industry yet. But I certainly in my experience, haven't seen boards actually operating in the way you described, where it's like all the CISO's responsibility all the time. In order to put boards in a position to be successful, however, CISOs, data protection officers, etc., do have to communicate, do have to bring clarity to what's going on, whether it's a board member, a CEO, or etc. People can only make decisions about what they're informed about,
Yep.
and then what they understand. So doing informing and making sure that the message we're communicating in a way that others understand it. That's certainly part of our job in the security and privacy world.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Very true. Um, One last question, which is, and this one is going to be fun. That from a security software or GRC software vendor perspective, what is one thing that the people who are selling security and GRC software should not be doing when they contact CISO?
Wow, just one thing.
I know it's hard, right? It's too many.
Okay, so from my perspective, it's promising to solve the entirety of the problem.
Yes.
Hey, you have, XYZ regulatory obligations. I've got a solution to like solve all your needs. Because probably you don't have a solution to solve any superset of regulatory needs. No company does. So being able to message more precisely and truthfully
Yes.
what solution, what issues you're actually addressing. What is the value proposition of the product? If you were to only, if the pitch was to only improve in one dimension, then for me, I would suggest accuracy and transparency.
And I think it's one thing is very hard to point out, right? One thing for me is don't call on my personal cell phone number. And when I say it's my personal cell phone number, don't call on it again, right? But that's the lighter side. But on the accuracy side, right? I think the buzzwords. People use so many buzzwords when they pitch it to you and said, I can do this, 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 and this. My AI is so strong and my analytics is so great that I'm going to solve all your world problems, right? Hunger is going to go away. Climate risk is going to get resolved. And everything else is also combined in that product, right? I think we all understand there is certain parts of marketing that needs to happen in terms of taking it forward. But at the same time, I think what are you promising? And are you really achieving that promise, right? I mean, I think even if you say that I'm going to achieve X and you get to 70-80% of it, I think I'll be a happy camper because I knew getting into it that there will be some things that will not work, right? But at the end of the day, if you're getting at least to the majority of the things that you are promising, I think that becomes a very big plus for me in terms of taking that product and talking to others about it as well, because that is helping me solve a problem in my organization. That is making my life easier. And I would want to share that out with everybody else to say that, hey, you know what, this is making my life easier. So I think that is one thing for me is I think, like Mike said, the transparency, be upfront in terms of what it could do. Buzzwords are great, and I'll take it with a pinch of salt. But yeah.
Mhm.
So what you're saying is my tagline, which says that if you've got budget, I'll solve it for you, is not the best way to go forward.
Well, if you're telling the truth, then that's great. Let's have a few conversations. Uh, but if it's hyperbole, then no, maybe change the tagline.
Yeah. No, I have so much fun on this podcast series, but thank you very much again, gentlemen. We covered so many areas of discussion that I think people who listen to this particular episode, they'll have a lot of fun. Thank you again to you both for joining in, for spending your time with us. We really appreciate this. Mike, Taslim, thank you, sir. And
Thank
stop
you,
the
everyone.
recording now. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, for having us.